Hi, everybody. We're going to get started in just a few minutes, but we figured we'd start letting people in now.
What?
Hi, Fox. Welcome in.
Hi.
Hi. We will get started in just a few. We're just waiting on a few more participants. Okay, we'll just give it one more minute and then we can get started. Okay, I think we can get started now. So welcome everybody. My name is Tyler. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Educational Programs Manager here at Center for Book Arts. Center for Book Arts was founded in 1974 and is the oldest nonprofit dedicated to uplifting and furthering the book arts through education, preservation, exhibition, art making, and community building. So we're here today as part of the Small Press Incubator program, which is an 8-week-long program dedicated to BIPOC writers and poets to create their small presses. And here we have one of our mentors, Rachel, who will be giving the lecture today. So a bit about Rachel. She is a writer living in Brooklyn and a co-founder of the Organism for Poetic Research, and is a member of Belladonna Collaborative and the managing editor at Litmus Press. She holds a PhD in English from New York University and teaches at Pratt Institute. So, without further ado, Rachel, do you want to take over?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for being here. It's exciting to see some um, friends and colleagues and mentors and mentees in the audience, the Zoom room. And thank you to the Center for Book Arts and to Tyler Rorty for inviting me to give this lecture um, on small press production or book production in general. And as part of the Small Press Incubator program, which is a really cool and exciting program in its first year, I think. And I have this kind of really amazing cohort also giving lectures, Lindsay Bookman, Christina Long, and G. Wesley. And so I feel quite lucky to be a part of this, and also some amazing mentees, Ruby Aguilar-Jones, Ola Akinmowo, Selah Mariama, and Jasmine Weber. And I'm really excited to see all of the work that they're going to produce through this program and beyond. My name is Rachel Glenn Wilson, and I'm a writer, an editor, and an educator. And I've worked in small press publishing for about a decade now, through running my own kind of small or micro press projects, in collaboration with friends and also solo, and working in various roles with different small press publishers like Belladonna Collaborative and Litmus Press, where I currently work. So just at the outset, I wanted to, I feel like it's important for me to say that while I've made a lot of books in my life, I don't have any formal training in bookmaking or in book design, and I'm not an expert in the craft of bookmaking. What I've learned about making books has come from peer skill sharing, informal apprenticeships, and lots of trial and error. It also comes from deep engagement with books themselves, and with the book as a material object, a personal and social experience, and from an interest in print culture, print networks, book arts, and artist books. So today I want to talk about book production as I think about it while wearing different hats and working on different projects. There's production from my perspective when I'm making a small poetry chapbook on my own, maybe with some printing or binding help from friends, for a totally desire run free press. I have kind of various little projects like that going on often. Or there's production from my perspective when working as managing editor of a small press with national distribution and initial print runs of 1,000 to 3,000 copies. And that's kind of the range of my experience. I don't have any kind of sort of larger press or academic press experience or anything like that. And then there are particular projects, artist edition or something more formally complicated or experimental, and those projects that kind of demand their own special considerations. So I'll sort of talk about a few of those. And my kind of hope for this lecture, my goal for the lecture is that by the end of it, you'll have a better sense of questions you want to ask about your own publishing projects, and ideally that we're all able to think at the same time more expansively and more particularly about books. So I'm gonna have a little slideshow that I'm going to share. And this always takes me a minute, I'm sorry. Here we are. Okay. Can everyone see that? Okay, and also, like, can everyone hear me too? Is my audio, I don't have like my headphones in, but if I need to put them in, I can. Okay, so to begin, I always want to begin with questions. So I had kind of minimize this little window, a few questions that I thought that would be, maybe be useful to kind of free write into and to return to structure the talk. I'm going to read them out loud. And of course, like in my ideal scenario, we would just like write for 30 minutes and then have a discussion. But because this is a lecture, a Zoom lecture, I'm just going to kind of put them out there, and hopefully, I'd love for you to kind of write into them throughout the talk. And of course, to like drop any thoughts that you have into the chat as we're going along. Maybe we can kind of bring some of that in to make this a little bit more dialogic, or we can circle back to to questions and comments and discussion at the end of the talk. So the questions that I have are, what is a book? What are some of its component parts? What's necessary to be a book? What does a book do? How does it book? What's bookness? What do you envision? This is the second. What do you envision as the steps that go into making a book? What are the steps you might want to ask yourself about the project as you progress through these steps? And the third question, what are some of the qualities of printed matter, specifically of print books, zines, chapbooks, that you love or find yourself drawn to? What do you find intriguing or exciting about print or about books or about a particular book or print object? So I'm going to start with the first question. What is a book? Admittedly, very broad question, maybe almost philosophically so. So I'm asking this broad kind of ontological question because I think it's almost always useful to begin simply, to examine basic assumptions and to define terms. In other words, before asking how to make a book, I want to know what a book is. And if we're beginning with basic definitions, it seems useful to go to a dictionary, not as an authority or a place that will resolve our questions, but as a resource that may add other layers to our understanding. And then maybe we'll turn to other people who have thought about books, what they are and what they do, namely bookmakers, writers, translators, artists, scholars. Then through an accumulation of layers, maybe we'll arrive at a working definition of a book, or we'll each arrive at some different cross-section of all the layers, and that might constitute our own personal understanding of a book. Etymologically, a book is something inscribed or written on. The word is thought to have derived from the word beech, as in a beech tree, whose wood was once used to make tablets for writing on. Many words for book, including the Latin liber and codex, as well as the Greek biblio, derive from the material substrate on which writing took place. Others, I think, like the Chinese shu and the Arabic kitab, derive from words that name the act of writing. And this seems to be a kind of common thing about this idea of the book, is that it's either sort of named for the material structure or substrate, and or the product of mark making on that substrate. So, that I think is a kind of beginning for a definition of a book. It's a little broad, however, and it leaves us with the sense that really anything that bears marks can be a book, including this painting of a book by Philip Guston. So I don't know, we might want to kind of go on from there. Going past the etymology of book to its definition, we find that Oxford English Dictionary defines a book here as a portable volume consisting of a series of written, printed, or illustrated pages bound together for ease of reading. So a portable volume consisting of a series of written, printed, or illustrated pages bound together for ease of reading. So for this next layer of understanding or describing a book, then I want to focus on the idea of portability, the idea of the book as a container or carrier. And this definition, I think, is usefully elaborated by the science fiction writer Ursula K. Le Guin in her essay, The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction. In this essay, Le Guin's really talking about storytelling and the novel, but I think her theories hold for books as well. In fact, she makes the connection explicit in this quotation that I've put on this slide. She says, "I would go so far as to say that the natural, proper, fitting shape of the novel might be that of a sack, a bag. A book holds words, words hold things, they bear meanings. A novel is a medicine bundle, holding things in a particular powerful relation to one another and to us." So Le Guin, following a feminist-inflected anthropological theory about human evolution that contends that the first human tool created was not a knife, but rather a sack or a carrier, argues that we need literary art forms that give expression to this history and principle of human development. Stories focus not on the high drama of the hunt and the heroic hunter, but on the domestic dramas of gathering and life among the gatherers. The story should be by us, for us, and so it should tell about everyday stuff, about sacks and gathering. The story should be less like an arrow, she argues, and more like a sack, which is more like a book. A book holds words, words hold things. The book, like the sack or carrier, is essentially a portable thing and holds other things. That is its primary function. And the effect is that what it ultimately ends up holding or holding together is something like history, culture, and peoples. The book, like the story, holds a people's self-knowledge, what's often referred to as cultural patrimony or heritage. This, I think, is why stories of the destruction of books, book burnings, manuscripts lost to fire or flood, or bombs that destroy entire libraries, evoke in many people a sense of horror. The book is understood as a carrier, a conduit, and a treasure house. But just to complicate a little this idea of the book as fundamentally portable, I've also included an image of the Fluxus artist Alison Knowles' 1967 sculpture, The Big Book. And that image on the left, and this is a kind of paper maquette for it. This is a sculptural book as environment that a person is meant to move through. The Big Book was 8 feet high, had a title page and 8 pages anchored to a metal spine that could be turned as they were mounted on casters. The book contained a stove, a telephone, a bed, a chemical toilet, a library, kind of in a nice circular way, a guest book, a gallery with artworks by artist friends, a lush meadow, a ventilator, and other utensils in the spaces between the pages. Technically, it was portable too, since it was designed to break down and be packed into 2 crates, but maybe not as portable as we would typically expect a book to be. But I do kind of, I find that every time I try to think about what a book is, there's some example of, a book that kind of confounds some aspect of what we think of as a book. I think that brings us to the next definition I want to consider, which is the book as a woven thing, as a ritual means and a place of gathering. So this kind of idea of books as being a kind of a container or holder, a carrier of culture, kind of gets me, I think, to thinking about the book as a woven thing. This understanding of the book comes in particular from reading Michael Bazzett's recent translation of the Quiché Mayan creation story, the Popol Vuh, which is thought to be more than 2,000 years old, though the earliest known transcription of the story dates back around 500 years. The name of the story, the Popol Vuh, means the book of the woven mat in Quiché Mayan. And as Bassett writes in his translator's introduction and notes to the book, these are the quotes here. He says, the words Popol Vuh derive literally from the book of the woven mat. The story serves as a meeting place, a mat where people gather to hear its truth be told. The imagery of the book as a piece of weaving evokes both a work of intersecting strands and patterns and the interwoven fibers of a culture, much as the word text derives from the Latin textus, meaning a woven thing. One can envision the Quiché priests consulting this ancient text, gathered on their 4-cornered council mat, itself an embodiment of the Mayan conception of the 4-cornered universe. Thus, maize-field, council mat, page, and universe are all invoked, their 4 sides and corners measured and staked, merging into a single space of gathering and sustenance. And I do really love this way of thinking about the book as a kind of pulling together of many threads to make a whole fabric, and also as a social medium, a kind of this mapping of like a literary text or story into the book as a physical object, which then becomes a kind of space in which, people gather, culture happens, community exists. The poet publisher Nicole Cecilia Delgado writes about the book also as a medium of social connection and exchange in an essay a mano, by hand, which is about bookmaking, and her risograph shop La Impresora, which is based in Puerto Rico. And about La Impresora, she says, I've come to think that the books we make by hand are not properly commodities, but rather points of encounter that adapt and circulate among our communities under another more noble, more fluid logic. So this kind of idea of the book as being a kind of a stitch or a point of encounter, kind of gathering is something that I want to kind of think about. A few examples of a kind of literalization of the book as a textile. Here on the right is a sewn book by Louise Bourgeois, Ode à l'oubli. And these are books with kind of quilted pages that are then sort of bound by sewing as well into this sort of fabric codex form. And then on the left, a story quilt by Faith Ringgold with the central image, and then around that central image, all of the text from her story Tar Beach, which was later published in an illustrated kind of children's book format. So just kind of at the top and the bottom is all of the text, and then this image is also kind of reproduced inside of the book, along with a series of other images she created. But she also has many other story quilts that sort of, I think about this possibility of kind of remediating the book as a quilt or the quilt as a book. So the last one I kind of wanted to mention here is Su Hui's Star Gauge, also sometimes translated as the Armillary Sphere Map, which is another profound example of the textile as book. And this image is from a painting of Su Hui's poem, which she composed in the 4th century in China. And he originally embroidered her palindrome poem in 5 colors in a grid of 29 characters by 29 characters that can be read in all directions, horizontally, vertically, and diagonally, moving from clockwise readings around the perimeter to branching readings or readings that branch off on diagonals and then move rectilinearly again. And it can kind of go around and up and then sort of around again. And in the other direction, it's palindrome, so it reads both ways, to produce a multiplicity of poems within poems, literally thousands, and some people think even tens of thousands of readings or discrete poems that are inside of this kind of one map. So I kind of would argue for an understanding of this sort of embroidered poem also as a book. I don't want to continue too long on this question, what is a book? But there are just a few other sort of ideas that are worth touching on before we move to the next part of the talk, which is more properly production oriented. So I wanted to call attention to book artist and historian Johanna Drucker's theorizations of the book from The Century of Artist Books, a kind of foundational text in artist books. Drucker, emphasizing the unity of a book, particularly, though not exclusively, with regard to the area of artist books, writes right over here, every book, oh, I'm sorry, let me read another quote from her. A book should be thought of as a whole. A book is an entity to be reckoned with in its entirety. The most successful books are those which account for the interrelations of conceptual and formal elements, thematic and material concerns. And then approaching the book with a more wide-angle lens, but still emphasizing the synthetic or synthesized quality of the book, she writes, every book is a metaphor, an object of associations and history, cultural meanings and production values, spiritual possibilities and poetic spaces. And last, very simply, she states, a book is a highly complex organization of material and conceptual elements. For Drucker, the book is composite, but whole, fundamentally made of parts, and yet, as she puts it, an entity. In other words, the book is maybe a lot like an organism, or better yet, a person, individual and relational, part of its social historical context, and therefore also reproductive of certain politics and ideology, but also an expression of idiosyncratic poetic, material, and metaphysical excess. In The Century of Artist Books, Drucker makes a useful distinction between the book and the codex. A codex, she says, is, quote, a set of bound leaves or pages fixed in a rigid sequence by being clasped or held on one side. It postdates other forms of the book, such as the tablet, the scroll, or the accordion fold book, but is now almost synonymous with what we think of as a book. These are a few concertina fold books or leporellos by the poet and artist Attel Adnan. And then, well, maybe I won't bother to take us out of the slide because I'm afraid if I click on this, I won't be able to find my way back. But there's, I was wanting also to show this sort of scroll format concertina fold work, La Prose du Transsibérien by Sonia Delany and Blaise Cendrars, but you probably already know it. And that's a scroll format leporello. The concertina fold format is really an immediate precursor to the codex form. And what's interesting about it, I think, is the way that it emphasizes the centrality of sequence to the codex form. Attel Adnan, who grew up in French-occupied Lebanon to a Syrian father and Greek mother, speaking primarily in French, and yet living simultaneously in relation and estrangement to Turkish, Greek, and Arabic, said that when she turned to painting later in life, she realized that she wanted to, quote, paint in Arabic, end quote. And then in this autobiographical essay to write in a foreign language, she says, one day when I decided to write, or to be precise, copy poetry in Arabic with the intent to integrate calligraphy into a style of working with watercolors and inks, which was contemporary, I engaged myself on a trail that is still in front of me. I found Japanese folded papers, like the old books of Japanese woodcuts, where each double page was an image tied or not tied to the following ones. Year after year, I worked on these long papers, like horizontal scrolls, with my imperfect writing, aware that it was the opposite of classical calligraphy that was at stake. It was reading through the art of a poet's work. They represent to me a coming to terms with the many threads that make up the tapestry of my life. And that, I wanted to read that full passage, but really what I want to highlight out of that is the sense of this book as a sequence, or what she refers to as a double page, where each page is tied or not to the preceding and the following pages. So I think the leporello's double page gets kind of translated into the codex form in two ways. It becomes the page spread, and that's the kind of doubleness, and it becomes the double-sided leaf. So the kind of front and back side of a page. Each page exists in relation to what's across the binding or the gutter and to what's on its reverse side. In that way, the entire book is made up of a system of relations. It's structural. These are some books by the artist Diderot on the left, a series of kind of cut books that he made that really are about kind of sequence. When you turn the pages of these books or move, I think they're loose leaf in a kind of case binding thing, you get a kind of suddenly these different sort of compositions based on the kind of cuts and the colors of the pages. And on the right, there's a quote from Ulysses Carrion, a Mexican conceptual artist, 20th century artist, who is arguably one of the most influential book arts theorists of the 20th century, I think. And he writes about this fundamentally sequential nature of the book in a really kind of canonical manifesto essay, The New Art of Making Books. And I love this kind of also because it comes back to some of the places that I started out with thinking about books and kind of contradicts some of the things that I've said already. So Carrion writes, a book is a sequence of spaces. Each of these spaces is perceived at a different moment. A book is also a sequence of moments. A book is not a case of words, nor a bag of words, nor a bearer of words. A book is a space-time sequence. Books existed originally as containers of literary texts, but books seen as autonomous realities can contain any written language, not only literary language, or even any other system of signs. A book can also exist as an autonomous and self-sufficient form, including perhaps a text that emphasizes that form, a text that is an organic part of that form. Here begins the new art of making books. To make a book is to actualize its ideal space-time sequence by means of the creation of a parallel sequence of signs, be it linguistic or other. And this is just a short passage out of that essay, which is an excellent essay. on books and kind of thinking very expansively about books and very structurally about books. So I recommend it, and I think you can find it very easily. If we take sequence like Carry-On does to be the defining feature of the book, then we wind up somewhere akin to when we first defined a book as a substrate on which marks are made. Suddenly there's some confusion about whether any spatial sequence, a film, an architectural structure, a walk, or any serial composition could be considered a book. In some ways, that's perhaps a little annoying and certainly defies our common sense understanding of the medium. But in other ways, I think it can be sort of liberating. Earlier, I said that we wouldn't want to confuse Philip Guston's painting of a book with an actual book. But what about the artist Colleen Smith's series of gouache and graphite drawings that make up the work of the Black Feminist Loner Library, 1989-2019, or the Human 3.0 reading list? These 14 drawings in the earlier sequence and 30 in the later one constitute a bibliography, a reading list, and a library, as their respective titles indicate. I'm going to just leave the question of defining a book there, and also, encourage you to read Colleen Smith's Human 3.0 Reading List Manifesto, which could not be more brilliant. Because I think you can see how we can arrive at a place where we understand the book less as an actual thing that exists objectively, and more as a framework, a set of ideas, or what Drucker calls a, quote, zone of activity rather than a category into which to place works by evaluating whether they meet or fail to meet certain rigid criteria. So I would, I think that you start thinking about books too much, and really, almost anything could be a book. And then you've kind of found yourself back at the beginning. So now that we have no idea what a book is after all, how do we go about making one? And this brings us to question 2 of the free write. What do you envision as the steps that go into making a book? What are the questions you might want to ask yourself about the project as you progress through these steps? I conceptualize the bookmaking process as having 3 main areas beyond composition. And those are editing first, and then design/production second, and then promotion/distribution third. But they're not really discrete steps. Composition happens in tandem with editing, and then editing happens during design and production, and then production is still going on when you start to do promotion. So within these overlapping stages, I'll hone in on the production stage, of course, and I want to break that down into 2 steps, which I am going to call, and I hope it's not too sort of cheesy, I'm going to call these 2 steps within production gathering and cooking. Gathering and cooking. So gathering, excuse me, is a term in bookmaking. It refers to the process of assembling individual sheets or signatures into the correct sequence for binding. It's also used in its noun form, a gathering, as a near synonym of the term signature, which refers to 2 or more printed sheets of paper stacked and folded as a group. So where you just kind of take, this is a sort of diagram of a front and back page that could be folded to begin to make a signature. So 2 or more of those to make a signature, stacked and folded as a group, typically making a unit of 16 pages that will be assembled, 16 or 32, that will be assembled and bound in a specific sequence to make the book. But before we get to that point, by gathering, I simply mean that the first thing you need to do is literally to gather up your materials, your texts, images, whatever is going into the book, whatever is going to be remediated by the book format. And then you need to consider these materials in terms of their physical materialization. In other words, what are the media, the text or other media going kind of quote unquote into the book, and what are the media or materials of the book, right? And it's kind of hard to talk about these things because it's like the materials and the materials, but I hope that that distinction is clear enough. There are sort of materials or media that you start with, kind of text, things that maybe in some ways have to have a certain kind of fungibility because you're translating them into the book as a medium. If you're planning to make this book yourself by hand or DIY, you need to gather up materials as in paper, maybe book boards, cloth, thread, glue, ink, type. There are a variety of materials that different projects call for. And at this stage, you should be asking yourself, what is it that my book needs? If we consider the book to be a unit or an entity, as Drucker puts it, we should think about the book's media and the book's materials together at the outset. They affect each other. The same goes for if you're outsourcing production. You still need to consider things like size and format, substrate, likely some kind of paper, color, printing method, binding, and finishing. So my kind of gathering questions. Oh, where did they go? Ha. Okay. Gathering questions. Does my project have specific needs? Are the media texts and materials more or less interdependent or independent considerations? Or more or less independent or interdependent? In what ways do my materials need to conform to the texts I'm remediating or to the ideas I have about my project? Conversely, can my texts and my ideas be influenced by the materials, perhaps the materials and tools that are at my disposal, and or to the process of making? So can you kind of improvise a little? And then are there parts of my project that are idea fixed and others that are more open to the unexpected effects of process and materials? So sometimes you might actually be experimenting to compose the book in the process of bookmaking. I think sometimes I think of projects like, this is a good and a bad example, so I'm hesitating around it, but Frank O'Hara and Larry Rivers' stones on the left, which they made by drawing directly onto lithography stones and then printing from these sort of free improvisations. But I think actually it's a little bit of a myth that it was a free improvisation. That probably had some, I think, some preparatory materials like a journal. So I struggled to find an example of a book that is kind of really, really made in the process of making. Another one I thought of was Seth Sieglob's Xerox book, which is on the right there. This is a 1968 group exhibition as a book, featuring work created specifically for Xerox, which was a new printing technology at the time. So the artists who were featured in this kind of book exhibition created works for Xerox. And then ironically, actually, they couldn't make the book via Xerox because it was too expensive. So they offset print it. So anyway, I think that they serve, I think, well enough as examples of books that in a sense speak book as their native language. There aren't exactly kind of prior texts that are then remediated by the book in the way that we think about like someone sort of writing a novel and then kind of making a book out of it. Materials are generated in the process of making the book rather than being translated from one format into another. And this is, I think, a very rare way to make a book. It's more common with artist books or one-of-a-kind books. But again, I think we start to interrogate it and it becomes unclear whether this kind of ideal book can even really exist. I think there's something about the book that is always inherently about a kind of process of remediation. However, dreaming of this kind of ideal and immediate book, Ulysses Carrion wrote that, quote, the most beautiful and perfect book in the world is a book with only blank pages. So this kind of idea of just this like the totally ideal book that's just about the kind of the structure again. I think that talking about this with a friend, someone brought up Holly Melgard's Black Friday, which is a kind of conceptual book, 740 page book at standard letter size paper dimensions, that's designed as a kind of solid black book. And it's kind of intended to break a print on demand printer. So it's a sort of book as performance. And I would say that like the book kind of occurs at the point at which it's either brought into print or it can't be brought into print because it's too much ink for the printer. So, I mean, I think there are the kind of these possibilities of books that kind of are really, they're kind of conceived as the process of making a book. Or as I'm kind of putting it, they like speak book as their native language, but it's a difficult category to really think about. At the other end of the spectrum of uh, highly medium specific books are publishing projects that have extreme uniformity, like, for example, the French Edition Gallimard. Those are in the center there. They've been using the kind of same cover design and basically the same format since 1919, and have a wide variety of books that are all kind of published in this same format with the same design, the same paper, totally independent of the content. You may have a press or a publishing project that you want to have a kind of strong visual identity. Like Gallimard, you might pick one or a few formats that will accommodate all of the books you want to publish, or you may have flexibility in some areas, but not others. You may want to implement unifying design principles like a repeating cover motif or a unified palette, the same house fonts, or the same overall page design. So if we kind of carry this translation metaphor forward here, we might say that for the majority of books, there's the process of remediation or translation of some media from a source language, often the manuscript, text, images, documents, to a target language, which is the book. A uniform approach to the translation process could mean a couple things. It could mean that the publisher, as a kind of translator of these materials, has a strong presence. She's a stylist who doesn't try to invisibilize her role, but rather foregrounds that act of translation. In translation, I think about someone like Anne Carson or Robert Fagles as a kind of stylist. In publishing, I think of presses like New Directions on the left, or a series like Ugly Duckling Press's 6x6 Poetry magazine on the right. And that one is a magazine that presented 6 poets per issue in the same 6x6 format with a clipped corner and a rubber band binding. And, you know, no matter whether the poem had long lines or was skinny or used the page in a very visual way, everything is kind of going into the same container. Same with the New Directions kind of monochrome covers, like the sort of very similar format for everything. It's a sort of imposition of style onto the content. Conversely, I would argue that that kind of uniformity to the approach in the sort of translation or remediation can also have nothing to do with style. It can indicate its absence, in fact. It can be a bit generic, expedient, insensitive to the source language, just the sort of like automatic, getting the job done sort of approach that I think that sometimes we see from big publishing, also from print-on-demand services, which tend to produce a kind of uniform product, things that are not content sensitive, right, or content responsive, and that don't really approach that work of translation to the book as an art form. And then sort of in the middle, I think of those two extremes, like the completely medium specific or the completely like, you know, really content independent, not in content insensitive, is the sort of middle ground book formats that are content independent in some ways, but content responsive in others. These are books whose makers think of book media and book materials as two sides of a coin, or like Ferdinand de Saussure's sign signifier dyad as two sides of a sheet of paper. They try to work out this relationship in specific and considered ways. I think most small press publishing falls into this category. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about some projects I've worked on because I know their history. And I can talk a little bit more about the considerations and decisions that were made. So on the top left and in the sort of the second one in the middle, top middle, that's a book, 16 Poems for Philip Guston by Clark Coolidge. It's a book that I edited, and it presents a collection of poems that were written by the Bay Area poet Clark Coolidge in response to a collection of paintings by the artist Philip Guston that were exhibited together in 1974. The book grew out of writing I had done on Coolidge and Guston's collaborations. And these poems had been published before in a small literary magazine, which is totally out of print, and I was able to find a digital kind of facsimile. But Coolidge's original vision for them had been to be presented as a book, along with the facing page reproductions of Guston's paintings. And I really wanted to make that happen. I wanted to kind of see that. I could see it in a way. And so I wanted to see it in print. I got permission from Coolidge and from Philip Guston's daughter, Musa Mayer, to make this book. And I wanted it to be really like a beautiful book, and I kind of knew it was a little bit beyond my capabilities for bookmaking. So I collaborated with a bookmaker friend, Gary Robbins, who runs an arts press in Portland, Oregon called Container Core. We talked a lot about how to bring this work to the page in a way that would do justice to Guston's paintings, and also to convey the sense of the poems and paintings as being peers in dialogue, or kind of more like friends having a conversation. So the first challenge was figuring out how to deal with the variety of size and format in Guston's paintings. The largest painting was 77 inches high by 128 inches long or wide. And then the smallest was 53 by 54 inches. So that kind of, I think, demonstrates the variability of the format from the nearly square to a long landscape-oriented kind of rectangle, very horizontal. So we wanted to be able to kind of present these works in a way that would demonstrate that that range of size and format, to kind of show the scale of the paintings. And Gary had this idea of kind of trying to like hang the paintings inside of the book as if in a gallery show. So he created this sort of cartoonish baseline that you can see at the bottom of the book that runs along the footer, which gave the page a kind of perspectival depth, as if we're looking at the meeting point of the floor and the wall. And then he placed the images in relation to this line, like a gallery technician would hang a painting at eye level. So they're all sort of at different places on the page to page. And each image was scaled in relation to all of the others, so that they were kind of considered as a unit. Some are much smaller on the page, some really fill the page. And then the poems, on the other hand, were set at the same height, anchoring the pages against the variable position of the paintings. The square format of the book was another sort of stabilizing device. It gave enough space around the text and the images so that nothing felt cramped. I think it also kind of lends a little uniformity where the images are kind of very variable. And since Gary and I saw the works as kind of both playful and democratic, we didn't want to make a book that would be really expensive or self-serious, something that would read as a kind of fine edition. So the cartoonish line was like one thing that Gary came up with to kind of, bring in a little bit of the demotic kind of humor of the project. And then another was that when we began to think about how to kind of reproduce the images, we wanted to get the color right, and yet, there was a lot of images, and we didn't want to have to print in an expensive way, printing those images right onto the full page. So we decided that we would print them on sticker paper. That way the images could be ganged up onto one offset plate, and then we could print them all in large sheets. And then these sort of stickers were then cut out by hand and then hand tipped into the book. And it's kind of subtle, but you can sort of see, if you look close enough, that these are sort of tipped in, that they're printed on a sort of sticker sheet. And they look really nice, and they also have a kind of humor to them, I think. And then the book was only $40 to retail. So I think it kind of works out. On the far right is not a book, but a project that I learned a lot from and had a lot of fun with. This is for the Organism for Poetic Research. It was a broadside of a Vito Acconci poem, Removal Move Line of Evidence, the grid locations of streets alphabetized, Hagstrom's map of the 5 boroughs, 3 Manhattan. That's the name of the poem. We printed this in an edition of 150, pretty large for a broadside edition. We partly did this though because we were able to produce this broadside really cheaply, really inexpensively. And it was for the occasion of a talk that Acconci gave for the Organism for Poetic Research in 2014. The text we took from Acconci and Bernadette Mayer's journal 0 to 9. And it was a typescript that was 5 pages long, an 8.5 by 11 paper. We were wanting to make this into a broadside, and we were trying to think about how to do this in a way. The talk was about kind of moving from poetry to architecture, and we thought, like, wouldn't it be really cool to just kind of publish this in a scroll format, but uh, you know, vertically really long. It would sort of resonate with the idea of it being a map of Manhattan. And then we were struggling to think about how we could do that in a way that wouldn't be really expensive, oversized printing. Other than figuring out some way to like stitch pages together. How would we kind of keep it as a unit? So we hunted around and found a printer in Manhattan called Soho Reprographics that still had a blue line diazo print machine, and they were able to make this broadside there on architectural, kind of blueprint paper, which was a kind of great, almost coincidence, and I think kind of really brought this poem to life in a different way. So that was Soho Reprographics, and I think we sold them for like a sliding scale cost of maybe suggested $10 or something like that. I mean, I think we gave a lot of them away actually too. So I mean, 150 copies was a nice. They were just not meant to be like, they were very cool, but not meant to be like precious or expensive art object broadsides. Um, Although I think now people are reselling them for a lot more money than that. So in the middle here is an artist's edition I helped make for Litmus Press. Just gonna check the time. Okay, I'll hurry up a little bit. So this was a book by the poet Elizabeth Willis and artist Nancy Bowen. And Bowen took Willis's poem, The Witch, and broke it up into its 46 stanzas, which she then paired with images that were created by drawing, painting, and collage. We produced this book in a trade paperback format. We also created an afterword. It was a conversation between Bowen and Willis and Litmus editor E. Tracy Grinnell. And so the paperback format was the images on one side, the hand lettered text on the other, on the recto, or maybe vice versa, and then the afterword at the end. And I think that makes it like available to a broad audience, but we also, we loved these images that Nancy had created. They were really beautiful, and we wanted to make another object that would kind of that would also be an art object. So we made an artist book edition for this project as well. So there's sort of two different editions, and for the artist book we screen printed the cards in the format that Nancy had originally made them, with the text under the image. We screen printed them almost kind of like a large, oversized deck of cards, with Lane Sell at Shoestring Press in Crown Heights. And then we created a kind of broadside with texts that sort of touched on the context of the project, which is kind of persecution of witchcraft, the kind of colonial context of witch scares, and thinking about this through like Sylvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch, and other texts like that. So we created this broadside. It was printed, also screen printed on a sort of high-tech water resistant paper called Evalon. That became a wrapper for the cards. We printed the afterword as a hand-sewn pamphlet. And then Nancy Bowen created these sort of glazed ceramic objects that also go into the edition, and we housed them inside of sort of antique cigar boxes. And Elizabeth Willis had already been collecting these cigar boxes for a while. So we started with her collection, and then we sort of rounded it out by doing a lot of thrift shop hunting, and then printed also this sort of cover image on a sticker paper that's stuck on top of the cigar box. But the cigar box sort of on the inside has all of the original branding and markings. And I think sort of they often have kind of also kind of colonial motifs that sort of resonated with this kind of connection idea of witch hunts and kind of witch persecution as related to kind of Christian colonial context and anxieties and capitalist expansion. So that's and misogyny, right? So that's the sort of artist edition there that you see. And it was just a kind of way of thinking about like how could this project be translated in different ways, right? And in order to become sort of projects that achieved different things, right? So and could reach different audiences as well. So so that's that. And then the last one, I'm sorry, here on the left is another Litmus Press project, Another Room to Live in, 15 Contemporary Arab Poets. And this book, in some ways, is kind of more straightforward, and in other ways was very complicated. It's a book that's featuring 15 poets writing in 3 different languages, French, Arabic, and English. And then each poet is translated into another one of those 3 languages. So in the 15 sections of the book, there are different language pairs. Arabic reads in a different direction than French and English. And so part of the kind of challenge of this book was kind of thinking about how to sequence the book. It was really a kind of, it really drove a lot of thinking about the book as a kind of sequential experience, and how to kind of make it accessible and intuitive to a reader, so that you could read through poems and translators' notes and authors' notes in the first language, the kind of source language, and then find the target language, which is often, if you're reading from the sort of English language front of the book, you would have to kind of skip ahead and read back. So we did things like, there was a lot of thinking about how to organize things within sections. And then we used like a kind of visual edge mark to allow the reader to be able to kind of see where the subsection starts or where the next section starts without having to reference the table of contents. And that was just an interesting project to kind of work out. Somehow it was a lot more kind of structurally complicated than I can even describe here. So while each of these projects was driven by a desire to find the right form for the book, sometimes there is no right form. Or it might mean 2 or more forms: artist edition and trade edition, digital and print, print and audio, codex and scroll, codex and installation, etc. While I happen to be drawn to books that are more responsive to the media they're remediating, I also appreciate presses with a strong visual identity. I don't think there's anything inherently good or bad about being flexible or inflexible about your design ideas in relation to the media text of the book. Similarly, there's nothing better or worse about being open or closed to material constraints in relation to design ideas. Sometimes you want a very specific, precise outcome, and you'll do whatever it takes to achieve it, even if it's expensive, time-consuming, wasteful, and difficult. Other times you might feel like you want your book to be open to contingency, constraint, chance, or experimentation. There may be a philosophical, political, or artistic reason for doing so. For example, maybe you want to work with what's at hand for economic or ecological reasons. Truly, I think there is no better or worse way to make a book. The best way is simply a considered way, or at least a deliberate way, even if it's deliberately unconsidered. So I put together a kind of list of questions for bookmaking that I think just also sort of reiterates some of the things that I've already talked about here. But I'm happy to share any of these slides later if anybody wants them. I'm not going to read them because I do want to leave time for questions. Maybe one thing to mention here, this last bullet point on questions for bookmaking. Just this question of economy and ecology, I think, comes up in bookmaking, and I think is maybe in some ways one of the drivers of like the standard book formats. It's more economical and more ecological to use more of the sheet when you're making a book. So there are kind of standard book sizes that lend themselves to the kind of division of the press sheet, right? And so, if you have less paper waste, your book will be less expensive and it will be less wasteful. So there's sometimes this kind of way in which economy and ecology go hand in hand in bookmaking. Other times I think they don't. For example, if you use paper from more environmentally responsible paper mills, it's probably going to be more expensive than like your kind of cheapest, quick and dirty sort of chemical toxic paper. So also sewing your binding is going to make your book last longer, but it's going to be a little bit more money, like a Smithsonian binding. It's not a lot more actually than a kind of perfect bind, but so anyway, until you start printing the book, or for an ebook, converting design and format files to the ebook format, you're still in the gathering stage, which encompasses the entire process of assembling manuscript materials and strategizing their remediation as a book. If we think of a book as moving from raw manuscript materials to an editing and overlapping design stage during which the materials marinate, and we set up the mise en place to kind of use that the cooking terminology, then the next steps are cooking and plating, which are analogous to printing and publishing. So this is where we kind of move from what I was saying, like gathering to cooking. Whereas the gathering stage involves a lot of process and patience and can be wildly variable in duration, the high heat cooking stage is different. Gathering can take very little time at all. For example, a zine or a book that's really straightforward, or it can take months or even not uncommonly years. A standard time frame for producing a book in small press poetry publishing from the truly final manuscript delivery to the print books in hand is usually 12 months, or often 12 months. 3/4 of this time is gathering and the last quarter is cooking. That's when you have definite ideas about your printing method. The book has already been designed. You know what color system you're using, the paper types you want, the binding method, the cover finish, and any other special things you may want to do with your book. At this point, you'll likely have a kind of recipe in hand. It might look like some combinations of items from this menu: printing method, binding, color system, paper, considerations, cover finish, any special things that you're doing to the book. And then that's basically production. It's this long middle that overlaps with the editorial process on one side and the promotion and distribution processes on the other. And then everything after production, after gathering and cooking, is really the entire life of the book. And that, I think, gets us to the sort of third last question that we started with. What are some of the qualities of printed matter, and specifically of print books, zines, chapbooks, that you love or find yourself drawn to? What do you find intriguing or exciting about print, or about books, or about a particular book or print object? I think that this line of questioning is the most important one when thinking about production. And then just try to be creative with book production. Also talk to people who make books. Book people are generally really into talking about their trade. Talk to printers who are a wealth of knowledge. Look at books, inspect them, read the colophon, find out where the books you like have been made, where they've been printed, what kind of paper they use, how they've printed the covers versus the interior. Look at the bindings. Think about what you can do with what you have or what's near to hand. Think about how to use everything. What I love most about books is that they're read. Reading asks us to slow down, to be in conversation with ourselves, with others, with our surroundings, our past, our futures. The book comes into existence through production, but until it's read, it's just the form of a book. The book artist Tia Blassingame stresses this point in particular with regard to artist books, but I think it's a useful reminder in general, especially as we're increasingly acculturated to what I would call kind of quick information gleaning from text and images. So Blassingame says, quote, "I think it's so important to read artist books. It's not just you look over it and look at the pretty pictures and read the colophon and move on. You try to have the experience that the artist intended. You have to do what you do with any book for it to activate you in that change. You have to read it." And this idea is completely key for me. The book comes into existence through a production process that is hopefully also a very intimate way of reading and translating materials into a new form, which will enable them to reach a more expansive audience. And then it's up to all these people to read and keep translating the book. We read the book and the book reads us, or rather, in reading the book and its reader annotate each other. We move back into writing and the book cycle starts again. And thank you. So I see some questions in the chat, maybe.
Thank you so much for those wonderful slides. There were so many great references.
I hope that I did not go too fast or get too bogged down in any details.
No, it was perfect. Okay, so let's see. We do have requests for the slides.
Absolutely happy to share them, and like yeah, like little hyperlinks that were in. I'll make sure that I can get them all to you.
But yeah, so we can open up to questions. So if you want to put some questions in the chat, or if you'd like to unmute and ask some questions,
Yeah,
please.
and I'm like really, I would love to hear how other people think about books. I think we all have our own kind of very personal relationships to books, and sort of, yeah, the qualities of them that we love, like their smell, their tactility, certain memory of a book, um, a certain size or format of a book, like, I think I have like an affection for books that can fit in my pockets. That sort of portability quality.
I do have a question about production for you. So I'm curious because it seems like a really creative process in making sure that the book is like echoing the content, the form like echoes the content. And I'm curious about how much of those decisions are made from you and your team, and how much like the writer or the person like providing the content has to do with those decisions, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. Yeah, I would say at Litmus Press and similarly Belladonna Collaborative, the books were very open to, I mean, like the authors and translators are all very involved in the book process. Uh, Actually, like maybe an interesting place to start there is thinking about Belladonna Collaborative, which when we would create books, we would have a sort of book team, and there would be different people from the collaborative involved in the book team, and then the author as well. So they were there like kind of through the whole editorial design and production phase, through regular meetings. Yeah, being really involved in the process. And then Litmus, we invite a lot of input. It's not structured in that same kind of collaborative way. But we really like, we want to hear what someone has as a kind of vision for the book. We do have our own kind of aesthetic. And so there's sometimes like a little bit of like negotiation there that happens. But I think that the idea is also that the production is part of the book. I mean, I think it's this kind of funny thing about, yeah, that, I want to use this idea of translation where it's like you start with some media and then it kind of, it gets translated into this other kind of medium. But, that means that like the form content division it's always sticky, right? It's always like difficult to separate form and content. Like they are sort of inseparable, right? And so they're different, like it's just like the manuscript is distinct from the book, but the book is also a kind of version of the manuscript. It's like a realization of the manuscript in another form. So it's really important to respect like that the author is involved in that process, right? I think personally, but some authors and translators maybe just aren't interested. I've definitely worked with people who have said like, I have no design opinions, and that's fine too. And then you just kind of try to like work with the text to see what it's telling you to do, right? I mean, the texts, whatever they may be, like language or images or whatever, like they have a lot of information, and they have, they often do like like a poem tells you how to read it. And I do think that design and production is another form of reading. I love
I
the
have
idea
a,
of, mhm,
oh, I'm
yeah.
sorry. I have a question, Rachel.
Hi,
Thanks so
Tess.
much for that talk. I don't know if maybe I might just be like a total noob to book arts, so forgive me if this is a very basic question, but I was tracking your use of the word remediation
Mm,
across the talk, particularly because the most um, common way that I've heard that word is as a farmer doing soil remediation, like getting lead out of soil. And it's such
mm.
a beautiful and specific word for these kind of like translations or material translations. And I just wanted to hear if this is like a word that's particular to you, or if this is like something that you've picked up, or like what your use of that word
That's so
means.
interesting. That's like so super interesting because yeah, I think remediation has like maybe two connotations. Like one I'm almost thinking of as like a hyphenated version where like but when I'm using it, it's like remediation, like we're taking a media and then we're like turning it into another medium, like a manuscript to print, right? Or to like being typeset, right? Or like a silver gelatin photograph to offset or something like that, like taking one medium and like making it into another. But then like remediation has that sense that you're using it, which is like to heal, right? Is that kind of what it means in that context? Like to sort of like to, I mean, like in the soil context. I'm not sure if I.
Yeah, I think so, but I also like there is a kind of oftentimes like soil remediation, it's kind of a myth. Like you kind of do have to pull out the soil oftentimes and just bring new soil in, and like so there's
Mm,
like the contaminated soil, and then anyway,
mm,
yeah. So it
yeah.
feels overlapping, but I was just so interested and curious every time you said it. I was tickled.
Ah, I love that. No, I'm gonna have to like I'll have to read more about soil remediation and think about it in that context. Um yeah, it's super interesting. I hadn't had that in my head at all in any way though, to be honest.
I have a kind of like I don't know if it's a possibly answerable question, but I just want to say thank you for the amazing slide presentation. It
Mm.
was really enjoyable to see. I run I'm a lab manager to a digital print lab, and I want to open up the possibility of producing books created from an archival inkjet process next year, and like at least having it accessible to people. But I was wondering if maybe you had any suggestions, advice, because I bought a tiny little, not a tiny printer, but like
Mm.
a decent archival printer, inkjet printer that, and I'm just trying to
Cool.
start
That's
it's a slow rolling process.
So you primarily print digitally, and then what would your idea be to like do short runs kind of or
Um, my hope, well, right now with the printer lab, it's like associated to an artist residency here in Miami, the Bakehouse Art Complex. And it's the first time that a facility has been opened up to non-Bakehouse artists. So now the lab is able to serve artists of South Florida for
Cool.
digital archival inkjet printing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just like one little person in a tiny room. And
Mm-hmm.
as of now, it's just been like photo prints and things like that. And the cost for a large Epson format was like not possible for bookmaking.
Mm.
And that's why I ended up like purchasing this little tiny printer, the R2880, whatever technicalities, but it's
Mm-hmm.
decent. It's like a 17 or maybe 20 wide. Um, and I don't know necessarily if there's like a limit to like runs, maybe just like as long as the ink goes.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but
Mm-hmm.
maybe since I I I don't know if I'm ignorant in saying it, but I feel like there's not enough um accessibility to book production here in Miami for local
Mm-hmm.
artists,
Yeah.
especially at an affordable rate.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if maybe in other communities, other states, like if anybody has pointers, because it's something that
Mm.
I kind of want to implement into the city in the next,
Mm.
maybe next year.
Beautiful idea and vision. I love it. Yeah, I mean it sounds like a kind of great way to start. And then, I feel like, yeah, I mean, I kind of all you need, right, is a printer. right?
Yeah.
Or some like means of printing, and then yeah, and then you can make books. And I mean, the other thing, like I feel like your question brings up for me is like the thought about sort of, yeah, being able to kind of toggle between digital and print mediums. And I think that there are questions of I think like the more mediums, the more translations, the better in a way, right? Like, because that well, I guess, yeah, I like to proliferate. I like to think that something can be more than one thing. And that then it's also kind of differently accessible. Like, um, even like sometimes I want to access something as a digital format, like it's just simpler. That's the way I want to encounter it, for whatever reasons, yeah. And then sometimes it's like very important for me to have the print object. And I think if you can kind of do both, then they circulate in different ways. I think they reach people in different ways, meaning like they reach different people, but they reach the same person in different ways. And that I think is a really kind of a cool thing and possibility. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm not sure if I um have really addressed your question. I don't know about the I think the archival inkjet printer sounds really great. And then if there's some way to like set up some resources where artists are able to kind of be involved in the making process, like printing, or if there's a way to kind of create like binding and trimming station or something there where the artist could kind of like see the run through, like maybe they just want to make 50 copies of something, and it can be done kind of in-house there, and could be like a kind of space for gathering. I mean, I think looking into other places like La Impresora, like, or reaching out to them and asking like how they kind of created a community printing bookmaking space, would probably be really, that might be more insightful than anything I can tell you.
No, absolutely. Even just passing me like a name is just I can start from there. Just
Yeah.
like I mentioned, like here it's really we have like a few communities that are involved with like printmaking and things like that and like open labs, but at least
Yeah.
with the ability to like facilitate some sort of like production with the artist where it is collaborative in that sense. There is this kind of like um production element together, like even like a finding and trimming station table on the side, like that's awesome. Like I just yeah. um
Yeah. And Tyler might have, I think, some ideas too there, potentially.
Um, yeah, I think providing a space is so exciting. I think there's so many different levels of which you can do it, and I totally agree. There's like so many different ways you can do it. Um, like, you know, for CBA, like I schedule all of the workshops and everything, and so we talk a lot about like hosting workshops and how we can make them more accessible. So we offer lots of scholarships and sliding scale classes and online classes for those who aren't in New York. Um, and also with those kinds of spaces that are running classes, making sure that there's space for like studio members and like other people who want to come and use the space, and kind of just keeping in mind who your like audience is, I would say, and kind of just making sure that you are thinking of as many people as you can in that audience and making sure that they're like comfortable and able to access the space. Yeah, I think just like thinking through, I guess, like the target audience of like how that space would look. If that makes sense.
yeah, absolutely, for sure. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear about it more if you want to be in touch too. It sounds really cool.
I would love that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, totally agree. You're also always more than welcome to email me at education or my name at Center for Book Arts. Um, yeah, so always feel free to reach out.
Thank you so much.
I'm
I appreciate
I'm
it.
looking also at it looks like Fox had a comment in the chat too. The first thing I'm thinking about is accessibility in terms of cost. I don't want to make something that is too expensive for my community. Yeah, and I think that that's like a really key consideration. Especially maybe around like thinking about artist books. And I feel like one of the mentees in the program, Jasmine Weber, and I were talking about this the other day too, about like cost and expense and sort of passing those costs on to a reader in a certain way. Like I really love, I love the idea of gift economies. I also realize that, that making books is a lot of labor, and people need to be kind of compensated, and we need to value our own work. And working in poetry, like poets are always like giving everything away for free and like that, it's like, that's cool. But and so I mean, I also do understand, like, wanting to be sustainable, and I also understand that some projects like have certain demands, or there's like a vision for them that might require like expensive or very fine printing methods. And, I think if it's possible, like sometimes maybe the book that someone wants to produce wouldn't actually be the book, it wouldn't be what it was if it wasn't done in a certain way, right? And, and I guess that's where like I kind of think like that idea of like, can something be many things, like can be useful, right? And so making that spectral evidence edition in the sort of edition of 26 artists boxes, being able to do that, and then also to make a trade paperback that is $20, I feel like that's kind of one way to maybe address that. And they're not the same book, but they are, like they do, like they, so I think, and then maybe at some point like that trade edition can also become an ebook, and then that can circulate. I mean, Litmus like we've been thinking a lot about ebook editions because we have an international audience, and it's really expensive to ship a book overseas. It's just, it's cost prohibitive to get books overseas for a small publisher. So we're thinking about that, about ebook editions sometimes, and sometimes thinking about like, where are we printing? We do have a relationship now with a printer in Lithuania, so sometimes we've been printing there and then doing like drop ships to places in Europe. But yeah, that's like another kind of consideration too. So like thinking about cost. I feel like I had another thought there that I lost, but sorry.
I had a question about printing with tactility in mind. Like, I think what's so new and unique to me about book arts is like the physical relationship that a reader has with the object. And I think that a lot of the examples that you showed during your slides um were like art objects. And so I guess I'm just curious to hear about your experience like as a bookmaker and towing that line of like archiving these sorts of objects as precious, but then also designing with this idea that people will be interacting with them physically in mind.
Yeah. That's such a great question. Yeah, the book has to be handled, right? Like that, I think like fundamentally, like that is my the last note of my slide lecture, and the really what I feel is that the books are for reading. And that's where you encounter the tactility. It's the whole pleasure of it, right? And the kind of transmission of something. So yeah, they do need to be handled. But books are kind of sturdy, actually. Like, like I think there's this that like Nicholson Baker book, Double Fold, which is like about this sort of drive to like digitize and sort of discard library collections from maybe like the 1950s on. Maybe that's a little like 1950s, 70s, 80s kind of period. There was like a big push through different kind of reprographic technologies that were introduced to libraries to get rid of books, because and the sort of sales pitch for that was that like books are all falling apart. They're like gonna like disintegrate the next time that they're read. And, you know, but it's like not true, actually. Like books last an incredibly long time, and they can be handled, and they're designed to be handled. Yeah, and I think, yeah, even, you know, sort of add artist books with fragile materials, like, I mean, but they did open up one of those spectral evidence boxes and have like the cover come off the other day, but like, you know, we'll get binding tape and put it back on. It'll be fine. So I mean, I know like sometimes they are fragile, but I mean, I think, yeah, if something is calling to you in terms of experimenting with materials, yeah, I say like go for it and see what happens. And if the book disintegrates, then so be it, I guess, you know, right? Maybe that's part of the process, or like that's part of what it does. But that's also kind of very exciting.
Thank you. Yeah.
When we all disintegrate anyway. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, everybody, for all of these really great questions. It's always so great when there's space for people to ask questions, and they do, and it's very engaging, and it was super insightful for me to hear too. And thank you so, so much, Rachel. This was a really, really great talk, and there are so many great references. I know that I have a copy of the slides, so I can definitely pass that along to everyone.
Yep.
Yeah, so I've passed that along as well as the recording to everyone once I upload it. And we do have one more lecture as part of this series that will be happening tomorrow with Christina Long. I just sent a message in the chat with the link to the event if you're interested in that one. But yeah, thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great Halloween,
Thank
Yeah,
you.
happy Halloween, everybody.
Diwali, and
Mhm.
yeah, weekend. Bye.